the divine acupuncturist, the divine addiction medicine physician, the divine adolescent medicine physician, the divine adult reconstructive orthopedic surgeon, the divine aerospace medicine specialist, the divine alternative medicine physician, the divine anesthesiologist, the divine asthma and allergy specialist, the divine audiologist, the divine bariatric surgeon, bariatrician, the divine behavioral health and social services specialist, the divine cardiologist, the divine cardiothoracic surgeon, the divine cardiovascular surgeon, the divine child and adolescent psychiatrist, the divine child and adolescent psychologist, the divine child, teen, and young adult addiction treatment specialist, the divine chiropractor, the divine clinical informatician, the divine clinical neurophysiologist, the divine clinical pharmacologist, the divine clinical social worker, the divine colorectal surgeon, the divine critical care physician, the divine cytopathologist, the divine dental hygienist, the divine dentist, the divine dermatologic surgeon, the divine dermatologist, the divine dermatopathologist, the divine developmental behavioral pediatrician, the divine diabetic foot surgery physician, the divine diagnostic radiologist, the divine emergency medicine physician, the divine endocrine surgeon, the divine endocrinologist, the divine endodontist, the divine epileptologist, the divine family physician, the divine foot and ankle orthopedic surgeon, the divine forensic pathologist, the divine forensic psychiatrist, the divine gastroenterologist, the divine general surgeon, the divine geriatric psychiatrist, the divine geriatrician, the divine gynecologic oncologist, the divine hand surgeon, the divine headache medicine specialist, the divine hematologist, the divine hepatologist, the divine hip and knee orthopedic surgeon, the divine hospice and palliative medicine specialist, the divine hospital medicine specialist, the divine immunologist, the divine infectious disease specialist, the divine integrative medicine specialist, the divine internist, the divine interventional cardiologist, the divine interventional pain management specialist, the divine interventional spine medicine specialist, the divine massage therapist, the divine maternal and fetal medicine specialist, the divine medical geneticist, the divine medical toxicologist, the divine mental health counselor, the divine midwife, the divine naturopathic doctor, the divine neonatologist, the divine nephrologist, the divine neurologist, the divine neuromuscular physician, the divine neuropathologist, the divine neurophysiologist, the divine neuropsychologist, the divine neuroradiologist, the divine neurosurgeon, the divine nuclear medicine physician, the divine nurse practitioner, the divine nutritionist, the divine obstetrician gynecologist, the divine occupational medicine physician, the divine occupational therapist, the divine oculoplastic surgeon, the divine oncologist, the divine ophthalmologist, the divine optometrist, the divine oral and maxillofacial surgeon, the divine orthodontist, the divine orthopedic surgeon, the divine orthopedic trauma surgeon, the divine orthotic specialist, the divine osteopathic physician, the divine otolaryngologist, the divine otology and neurotology specialist, the divine pain medicine specialist, the divine pathologist, the divine pediatric cardiologist, the divine pediatric dentist, the divine pediatric dermatologist, the divine pediatric ear, nose, and throat specialist, the divine pediatric endocrinologist, the divine pediatric gastroenterologist, the divine pediatric hematologist oncologist, the divine pediatric intensivist, the divine pediatric neurologist, the divine pediatric orthopedic surgeon, the divine pediatric pathologist, the divine pediatric pulmonologist, the divine pediatric radiologist, the divine pediatric rheumatologist, the divine pediatric sports medicine specialist, the divine pediatric surgeon, the divine pediatrician, the divine periodontist, the divine phlebologist, the divine physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor, the divine physical therapist, the divine plastic surgeon, the divine plastic surgery hand surgeon, the divine podiatrist, the divine preventive medicine physician, the divine primary care physician, the divine prosthodontist, the divine psychiatrist, the divine psychoanalyst, the divine psychologist, the divine public psychiatry physician, the divine pulmonary critical care specialist, the divine pulmonologist, the divine radiation oncologist, the divine regenerative medicine physician, the divine registered dietitian, the divine reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist, the divine rheumatologist, the divine rhinologist, the divine sleep specialist, the divine spinal orthopedic surgeon, the divine spine surgeon, the divine sports medicine physician, the divine surgical oncologist, the divine transplant surgeon, the divine trauma surgeon, the divine urogynecologist, the divine urologist, the divine vascular interventional radiologist, the divine vascular neurologist, the divine vascular surgeon,